Okay, I would like to welcome to our class today Jim Taylor, who is a veteran. I have known Jim for many years. Let me just say in general that he early on in his career with the Navy was into nuclear submarines, which he'll tell you a little bit about. He worked his way up and retired as a Master Chief. Somewhere in that process, he also ventured into theology, becoming a minister and a chaplain and a supervisor of chaplain trainees, and then returned to the military realm and became active in directing and supervising in the veterans hospitals and administration, and overseeing several areas, or I think finally nationally, the VA chaplains. But one of the things that he is doing currently is finishing a dissertation, and his special topic is on moral injury. And so from his theological base, but also from his many years in the military, I think he has a tremendous amount of self-authority to say some very important things that you need to hear. So welcome, Jim, and I'm going to turn it over to you, and let me know any way that we can make you feel comfortable.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wagner and Larry. As Larry said, we've been very good friends and for a long time, starting with him as my own instructor, as he is for you now, but also then we became peers, and then friends, and now colleagues, and it's just been a joyful experience throughout my career. As he said, all those things are accurate. I was blessed with in my military experience, as well as my ministry, to be a vet and serve veterans further. My family history has lots of military in it. My father was a prisoner of war in World War II. My wife's father was a hospital corpsman who took care of Bataan Death March victims. I have two uncles that were in Korea. And so military has been a big part of my life and experience. And I have many experiences as a chaplain as well. So this is meaningful to me to be able to join you in your class today and be able to share with you some of that experience. I'd like to start my presentation with a story of Tony. Tony is an Italian man, born and raised in New York City. He has stereotype. He was that stereotype of an Italian in New York. He had a hot temper. He lived life on the edge. He got in trouble with the law, and this was back in the years where it was right about the time. It was the time of the Korean War, and he was given the opportunity by the judge to either go to jail or go to the military. So he said, well, maybe I'll go to the military. That sounds better. But his personality also followed him. So in his military training, he made it through his basic training, but of course, basic training was much shorter than it is now because he was headed right off to war. And he ended up as a Korean War, as a ground pounder. Ground pounders were those who just went wherever they could walk. And he was on a machine gun group, and he was like barely 5 foot tall, but he was given the duty of carrying the machine gun itself, which was probably weighed half as much as he did. And he had attitude about that, he told us. And I met Tony in a Korean War PTSD group at the Tampa VA Medical Center. In his life story, he talked about how he pushed and carried that gun and fussed and all that. And so you can imagine he didn't have much to, his sergeant didn't have a lot exciting to say about Tony. But one day he was told by his sergeant, given this duty because he didn't like Tony in the first place, but he was told to go clear an area that they would be traveling in. Now, that means that you go and kill everything living in a certain area before they would move forward. In that, he did that. He killed some soldiers. He killed some young men with weapons. He killed some animals. But in this one case, he found a very elderly man on his knees in his grass hut praying. And he said, well, I don't see him as a threat, so I'm going to leave him. After he finished his duty, he went back and he told the sergeant he had done it. Well, the sergeant, knowing Tony, he decided he better check. So he asked him, are you sure you got everybody? And so Tony told him about this one young man, or this one elderly man. And that sergeant pulled his weapon, pointed it right between Tony's eyes, and said, it's either you or him. So Tony went back and killed the old man. In killing him, he walked into the hut, pointed his rifle at the old man. The old man, still on his knees, put his hands together and begged for his life, and Tony shot him. Years later, now 70 years later, Tony is diagnosed with PTSD. I would diagnose him as having moral injury. Tony has had 4 car wrecks, and all 4 was because this old man on his knees has appeared on the hood of his car, and he has veered to avoid running over the old man. He was so dramatically real to him in his appearance. That is moral injury in my estimation. With that story as a backdrop for what we'll talk about, I want to talk a little bit about the ideas of moving from civilian to military. A civilian moral code is a unique mixture of rules formed by personal beliefs, learned family values, and either implied or explicit rules of social behavior passed on by our social group or our religious community. Civilians identify with individual mentality, their personal success, their family, their children, their retirement. Their family group is what we most as civilians focus on in our lives. We seek individualized meaning and purpose in our life. Military is a little bit different. It's group mentality. Many times folks will join the service to serve God, country, a particular cause, that sort of thing. But then there are the special acts of courage that you find in the military, and those are not about God and country. Those are about the protection of the person on your right and their left, their unit, their buddies, their peers, and that is so dynamically important with the military folks. If you even look at the Army Moral Code, it says loyalty is to bear truth and allegiance to the country, the Army, to the unit, and to other soldiers. Duty is to fulfill obligation. Respect is to treat people as they should be treated. Selflessness is the welfare of the nation and the Army and those that under you, that you lead, to honor the lives of the Army values. Integrity is the right and legal morality. personal courage, face fears, dangers, and adversity. So it's not what we would normally have in civilian life, but you are putting self aside for all of these high codes. If we look to moral injury, though, I'm going to give you about a few different definitions, but they all come down to kind of a common theme. Litz says that moral injury has been defined as perpetuation, failure to prevent, bearing witness of, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So you can commit a moral injury, you can omit and have a moral injury, you can witness and have a moral injury, or you can be informed of and have a moral injury. A more lengthy definition is by Ken Drescher, who is part of the VA's National PTSD organization. Moral injury is the change in one's view of or expectations about human capacity to behave in a just and ethical manner. This injury is brought about by bearing witness to perceived immoral acts, failure to stop such actions, or perpetration of immoral acts, especially those that are inhumane, cruel, depraved, or violent, bringing about pain, suffering, or death of others. I have another couple of definitions, but I want to stop there for a second and say, when you hear those two definitions, I want you to think about how many times, in an effort to genuinely care, many people who don't understand military experience will say, well, and try to help people who are struggling. Well, you were doing your duty. You were under orders. You were doing what you were supposed to do. You're a hero. And none of those mean anything to a person who feels as though they have allowed something that is against who they are morally and as a person. When they allow those kind of things to happen, it doesn't matter that you told them, well, it was okay because you were doing what you were told. You were under orders. It just doesn't work for them. Another definition is by Bill Nash. He defines moral injury as damage to a person resulting from a violent contradiction of deeply held moral beliefs. So even if you are following the orders of your military person, superior, if it goes against who you are, your moral beliefs, your soul will end up wounded. Finally, the individual, Jonathan Shea, who is one of the first psychologists to identify moral injury. He did that as a VA chaplain, and after some 30 years of counseling with those who had been identified as having PTSD, and he identifies moral injury as a betrayal of what is right by someone who holds first legitimate authority in a high stakes situation. So in all three of those, betrayal, an authority, and high stakes situation, to be a moral injury. So right now in the DSM-5, moral injury comes under the auspice of PTSD. There's many people who are striving to get it separated out. And I would like to share with you a couple of reasons why they're hoping to get those separated out. Although there are some symptom overlap. PTSD is a fear-based injury. So you have fear, disgust, horror, helplessness that you find in PTSD. Moral injury, there's more shame, guilt, anger, and outrage. With some of the things that are common to both are avoidance, re-experiencing, mood changes, and psychological arousal. Again, some of the overlap or the separateness and overlap are PTSD is a fear-based response and is treated by exposure or reevaluation of those cognitive, those events by discussing them or actually going and experiencing them, where that they happened, to get a new understanding, a new way of thinking about those experiences. Moral injury is a higher sense of alienation and purposelessness. Treatment addresses moral conflict and self-condemnation, which is very different than fear. A couple of the types of methodology that we see used in treating moral injury. I'll talk about a couple that are used, and then I'll go to what I personally find of value. One is cognitive processing therapy. In that, we seek to reverse negative emotional responses by emphasizing such things as mercy and grace and confession, repentance, forgiveness, other types of means that would help somebody to reevaluate how they feel about that act that occurred that causes that soul wounding experience called moral injury. Many researchers have looked at, or a number of researchers have looked at this. I say a number, these are all new things in mental health arena, and so many is not like years and years and years, but it is moral injury is an issue of high interest throughout the community, mental health community. So cognitive processing therapy, this study shows that it can be pathologized moral injury. What we mean by that is that it tends to, by trying to spend too much time thinking about the actual event that's caused your injury, you turn it into a pathology that you can't get out of. Inadequate responses to the arguments, and so it has limited effectiveness, they have found. Now, this has very positive effects in its use for PTSD, because you can redirect away from the fear and move and to get somebody to reevaluate their thought process, and that works extremely well with PTSD, not so well with moral injury. Adaptive disclosure is another new one that has been looked at, and it has a similar negative side effect. It is shown that it works again very well to let somebody go and experience. It's in adaptive disclosure is to focus on the war experience, the life threat, the loss, the more, and comprises about 8 90-minute sessions, and its aim is to plant healing seeds rather than prescribe a dose of treatment that cures. The goal is to provide veterans with a compelling, meaningful, and useful encounter with minimal harmful experiences. The hope is to offer moral repair consistent with acceptance and tolerance of pain and traumatic events. Again, even the author says that moral reassurance cannot negate or invalidate troubling and painful moral truths. So again, it's a good methodology, but it just doesn't meet the goals of what we need to have happen with those struggling with soul wounding moral injury. Where I have found value is in a new methodology called acceptance and commitment therapy. ACT is an acronym that they're using. The biggest difference between ACT and CPT is that ACT focuses specifically on the idea that one needs to accept what has happened and not so much try to reassign blame. This treatment is very effective in helping warriors to develop a new value-based lifestyle so that they can feel pain without being trapped by it. And we'll say more about that in a minute. The focus is on striving toward living one's values and accepting where they are now instead of comparing themselves to where they were and where they want to be. Joshua Knabb, who is a psychologist out in California, talks about emotional pain, and he speaks of pain of presence and pain of absence. The pain of presence is due to distressing psychological experience. The pain of absence is when we avoid thoughts about that experience, called experiential avoidance, which acts to produce continuous focus on the pain and resulting in being stuck in that pain. If we look closer at acceptance and commitment therapy, Jason Nusima, a psychologist and minister in the Veterans Administration, says the ACT model can be understood in 3 words: hold and move. Hold and move. Acceptance as the hold entails the willingness to acknowledge experience without being trapped in the experience. So have that awareness, but don't just spiral down by continuously focusing on the negative. Commitment is the move or the decision to enter into a new value-based life activities. I might pause for a second and tell you another story of another Korean War veteran that I had in my groups and he actually functioned quite well. But his value-based activity was that he was one of the regional directors for the Marine Corps gathering presents for children at Christmas time. And he was highly involved in it. He spent most of his limited personal funds as well as every dime he could raise to gather these presents every year. And he was always working year round trying to gather money so he could buy Christmas presents for kids who wouldn't get them. And I once sat down one-on-one with him to talk about how was this helpful to him? And he said, well, in Korea, I was in charge of burying my peers who were in the prison or war camp who died. They would, and Korea was a cold place. And normally the ground was so hard that we could not bury them. And so we would have these details to go and take out and bury somebody, but really it was just laying them on, scraping the ice off, laying them down and cover them up with snow and ice. And that bothered me so much that I decided I would come back and try to prevent any child from having to do without all that we had to do without when we were in Korean war camp. And it really, that renewed value of how he lived his life was very meaningful and very helpful to him in his way of living after that. The idea of acceptance in Acts deals with holding on to the awareness of negative experiences rather than ignoring or avoiding them. We have pause, or the hold is to accept and acknowledge that life inevitably involves suffering and difficult inner experiences. The life differences between having your car parked versus having your foot on the brake at a red light. So it's not that you're going to stay and constantly talk about those negative experiences, but you have stopped to hold and be aware of, acknowledge the reality that you have to stop at a red light, but then you again move forward. The ACT model seeks to move an individual away from the idea seen in the fear acronym. Fear is fusion, evaluating, avoiding, and reasoning. Fusing, as you may know already, is believing or perpetuating one's negative thoughts. Evaluating is the act of judging one's actions as good or bad, which can cause shame and separation. Avoiding ignores negative experience. Reasoning promotes and justifies your inaction because of what you have decided about yourself based on those negative experiences. So the ACTS process has different aspects. I'll run through those real quickly. Cognitive diffusion relates to being aware of one's thoughts in a tentative, distant, flexible manner, rather than becoming entangled and fused with the extreme idea. Acceptance is to be open to a full range of inner experiences, one's thoughts, feelings, sensations, without avoiding the experience. Present moment awareness is one focuses on one thing at a time with flexible, non-judgmental attitude. The observing self is a process where one seeks to maintain a sense of perspective on one's thoughts and actions while not becoming overwhelmed by those thoughts and actions. Values is the process of it involved in value-based guide to living. And committed action is the courageous and unwavering dedication to taking action connected to well-defined values. For me, these last two, the values and the committed action, are what makes ACT different than some of the other methodologies, because it seeks to move the person forward in a new direction. It does not avoid or dismiss the past. it's valuable that you recognize the past. It's valuable that you own the past, but rather than trying to manipulate the past, you turn and move towards a new value-based lifestyle. So in your class, you're looking at families as well. So when we have done something that violates our sacred connectedness with God, our family, our society, we tend to push back, push away. Whether because of something we have done or something we have left undone, we sometimes push ourselves and withdraw from all those that love. Conflict arises when veterans feel unworthy of love while the family members are seeking to help by offering love, which only causes them to many times go deeper into themselves. Our inability to forgive ourselves leads us to believe that we are a risk to others, to our family, to the community. Many of those suffering with moral injury say of themselves, I'm not worthy to live. I don't deserve to continue to be a part of what would be normal society. So if we cannot forgive ourselves, we cannot imagine anyone else doing so either. One of the driving emotions behind this tendency to withdraw is shame, specifically the expected negative judgment of others. By choosing to hide our true selves from them, we reinforce the unworthy beliefs in our own mind. In order to repair broken relationships, we need to take stock in what was lost. That's the acceptance in act. And find new values for living life. That's the commitment. By acknowledging the hurt that has occurred, we pave the way for restoring existing relationships and establish new relationships that are essential in our lives, to restore marriages, to live with our children again. The Veterans Administration has a program called let me think if I can remember the name of it. Warrior to Soulmate. And it is a marriage therapy session, and it's to help warriors to get to a place that they trust their wives again, their spouses, their peers enough to talk about these horrible experiences. If you had an experience where if you had children and they were at some point in a battle saw that a child in the war had a bomb on them, so that they had to shoot that child, and then to say that they don't feel worthy to be a parent anymore, but to be able to express that and then to find a higher call, a higher valued living of taking care of their own children again. This requires tremendous understanding, patience, and commitment from the family as well. And I'll venture to say that not many families don't make it. Many families, and it's not necessarily the spouses that are the first ones to give up. It's the military member who is unwilling to expose this shame and guilt that they feel, to the point that it destroys any opportunity for relationship. if we look at guilt a little bit closer at guilt, shame, and unforgiveness, guilt and shame are the concepts of culture that's cultural struggles to acknowledge. This struggle is because the deep root beneath these words is a word that we don't use much in society anymore. It's called sin. Sin is when we miss the mark, when we do something outside of what we believe or what our ethics say we should do, and we have done wrong in our own understanding. Guilt objectively refers to the act of violating a law, a code, or a moral value. Guilt describes the feeling that one has for a debt owed that cannot be paid. Shame is a painful feeling of being exposed or vulnerable. Shame anxiety is a painful anticipation of sudden exposure, which could lead to threat of contemptuous rejection. So they would think that if I tell my wife this, she's going to reject me anyway, so I'll reject her first. Unforgiveness is beyond the anger and fear of the initial transgression. The unforgiveness develops over time, results from hurts and motives and consequences that are replayed over and over in the victim's mind. Issues of guilt, shame, and forgiveness are issues of the spirit. They require us to deal with them in a spiritual context. This may be through mindfulness or through specific faith tradition. The idea of hold and move that we started with, that are found in ACT, are similar to the repentance and turning to live for Christ that are in Christian salvation and discipleship. Now, I bring this in because I am of the Christian tradition, but this equally applies to Islam or Judaism, or even to mindfulness, and for those who are not of a more traditional spiritual foundation. This also makes ACT a valuable method for care for community clergy who desire to help veterans in their congregations, because it ties together things the clergy know with what is proven theoretically through research that works, rather than having that divide between mental health and the church. Soul care by clergy is historically a preview of the clergy. Priests served as moral conscience, offered spiritual guidance, and pastoral care. C.S. Lewis, who was a theologian but also a chaplain in World War I, stated that when the battle causes soul wounding, then most veterans see this as sin. They see themselves as having committed evil. Care of the soul can come when one finds personal acceptance of the past, as well as commitment to a more meaningful future life in Christ. We have found in the VA that psychologists are encouraging in their groups to have a chaplain present. They have found great value in having chaplains. Specifically, chaplains are involved because they are specialists in guilt, shame, and forgiveness, which are spiritual issues. Restoration and community and rituals are there, have part of their work. Morals and ethics are under their authority. They represent the divine. There's less stigma still, even today, as much as mental health is is a part of society. There's less stigma about going to the chaplain than mental health providers. Indispensable qualities of a chaplain in moral injury work are the non-judgmental, the non-anxious, the compassionate, the patient with struggle, the transparent, and engaging where they are. Those are not necessarily unique to just chaplaincy, but people believe that those things are part of who a chaplain is. Well, that's what I have to offer today. I hope this has been meaningful to you, and I appreciate the time with you.
Thank you very much, Jim, for sharing with us and sharing from your heart. And if the students want to have a connection, would it be okay for me to give them that information?
Absolutely. Be very happy.
Okay, very good. Thank you again, and I'm very confident that this is going to be very helpful, to the students. Appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity.